Welcome, everybody. Welcome for joining us. Thank you for joining us for today's panel entitled Discussing the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, Instrumentalist or Rights-Based Approaches. On behalf of the Center for International Policy Studies here at the University of Ottawa, I would like to thank all the panelists and all the participants who are joining us today. For gatherings and events on campus, it is important to offer an Indigenous affirmation in support of reconciliation. We pay respect to the Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. Nous rendons également hommage à toutes les personnes autochtones qui habitent Ottawa, qu'elles soient de leur région ou d'ailleurs au Canada. Nous reconnaissons les gardiennes et gardiens des savoirs traditionnels de tous âges. Nous honorons aussi leurs dirigeantes et dirigeants d'hier, d'aujourd'hui et de demain, courage indéniable. I would like now to introduce our panelists. I will introduce them in the order of speaking. Christoph Zürcher is professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And we also have Ellen Miller, who is the Deputy Director of the Women, Peace and Security Policy Team in the Peace and Stabilization Operations Program at Global Affairs Canada. Following Ellen Miller, we will have Laura Huber, who is an assistant professor at the University of Mississippi, and Kathleen Jennings, who is head of research at the Faculty of Social Sciences, Oslo Metropolitan University. Welcome, everyone. I will now give the floor to Professor Zürcher.
Thank you, Anna, for the introduction. Welcome, everyone. It's a pleasure to have you here. My name is Christoph, and I will take maybe 20 minutes of our time to walk you through the main findings of the systematic review which we conducted, and which is the basis for today's panel discussion. So it's about 20 minutes of reviewing the main findings of the report. Then we have a discussion among the participants, Eileen, Kathleen, and Anna, Eileen, Kathleen, and Laura. And then we will have 30 minutes or so for Q&A. Give me 1 second here to share my screen with you. You should now be seeing my screen, is that correct?
Yep.
Excellent. So the panel discussion is a reflection on a systematic review, which we did over the last 10 months. And I feel I should start with a few slides about what a systematic review is, because it is different from a normal literature review. A systematic review attempts to collect all the empirical evidence. It does so by defining specified inclusion criteria in order to answer a specific research question. So it is based on predefined inclusion criteria, which means that we cannot include studies which we like and then exclude studies which we do not like. We define our inclusion criteria ex ante, we register those in a protocol, and then we follow that protocol. So that's one important part. Another part is make the methodology for the search explicit and reproducible. Then conduct a systematic search, which is quite complicated and usually requires the help of a professional research librarian, and we had a colleague who helped us. And then a systematic presentation. So different from a normal literature overview, the ambition is to collect all the empirical evidence and to minimize bias. Why are we doing this? Because it is an extremely important tool that can serve as an antidote to bias and wishful thinking, which we all struggle with, right? And also important, that kind of exercise builds the evidence which is needed for evidence-based policies, and public policies all around the world, public or private sector, they all at least claim that they are interested in evidence-based policy. So this is one tool that would support that. And then what really matters to me is in public policy, and especially international development, right? So when we finance one program, that means we cannot finance another program. So it's always a choice, right? We finance program A, which means no funding for program B. So if we have evidence on what works and what does not work, we may free up funds for the things that actually work. And in many, many areas, especially international development, that's the ethical thing to do, because there are things, you know, which help and things which don't help. And by filtering out the things which work, we free up precious funds for important things. Right? To give you an example, I did another systematic review a year ago in Afghanistan, and it's a very, very clear pattern. Some sectors work and some sectors don't work. So if we had not spent that much money on stabilization and good governance, we would have had way more money for rural development, for example, which means less people would be threatened by hunger now. So that's the kind of logic why we're doing this. A systematic review is complex and takes a lot of work and effort and you know, tons of attention to detail. So it's done in teams. And we had a great research team. It started in a graduate seminar in last January, and that's the team. So we had Mohsana Arefin, who now works for the Canadian government. We had Luan Borges, who is now back in his native Brazil and preparing a career in foreign service. Taha Doidar, who is also working for the Canadian government. We had our wonderful research librarian, Marcela Guzman, who helped us with the search. We had Diane Hoffman on the team, who is also working for the Canadian government. Mir Javid from Afghanistan, with a career in Afghanistan, but for a couple of years now in Canada, and now a PhD candidate at Carleton University. Catherine Kavanagh had a career as a geologist in many developing countries, also in Afghanistan, now working on a think tank for clean fuel. Leon Valentin, with experience in Haiti, now working for the Canadian government, and then myself. So this is a team effort, and I want to stress that it's not me. It really was a team effort, and honestly, I couldn't be prouder of my grad students for working with me on that. I think they did a fantastic job. So that's the team. You all know the context. The Women, Peace and Security agenda goes back to the Resolution 1325, which made it a top priority for UN and many member states. And the WPS agenda has basically established two things. One is in situations of violence and war, women are at extreme high risk of harm. So there has to be something, you know, we have to increase how we think and what we do about protection and relief. And the other thing WPS also did was to establish and to promote a more meaningful integration and participation for women in all things related to security. So that's the WPS agenda in a nutshell. It usually said to have 4 pillars. We only focus on the participation pillar, right? So that systematic review does not cover the whole broad field of WPS. It's only the participation pillar, and within the participation pillar, it's only the instrumentalist arguments. And we focus on the instrumentalist arguments because they're so prominent in public discourse. So as a prep work, we reconstructed the narrative in the public space about WPS, and instrumentalist arguments are clearly dominant. So to give an example, we scanned the websites of bilateral donors, of multilateral donors, of the largest NGOs for claims about WPS, and instrumentalist approach clearly dominate the picture. And I wonder why, and maybe that's something we can also then address in a panel, but that's a dominant narrative. To give an example, what an instrumentalist argument is, that is taken from a speech by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in November 2017 at the Defense Minister Conference in Vancouver. And the quotation goes like this: through our feminist foreign policy, Canada is demonstrating its deep commitment to advancing gender equality and women's empowerment around the world. Then making reference to a UN Security Council resolution, which noted that the substantial link between women's meaningful involvement in peace operations and the achievement of long-term sustainable peace. So that's in a nutshell. That's the key instrumentalist claim. Involve women in peace operations, and there will be better outcomes in terms of peace. That's instrumentalist, right? It serves a purpose. When we screened the websites of donors and organizations for the narrative, we found that the 3 claims are very often made. And we focus in that systematic review on these 3 claims, which are, I missed the slide, which are these, right? So the first claim is the operational effectiveness claim, which is very prominent within the UN. That refers to peacekeeping. And that says the participation and inclusion of women make UN-led peacekeeping more effective. Right? It doesn't say more just or more conducive to women leadership positions in the army or something like that. It says more effective. So it's the effectiveness claim. The second one is including women in formal peace negotiations will have an impact on the quality of that peace. That's the better peace claim. So include women in formal peace negotiations and peace will be more durable or of higher quality. That is a very prominent claim, which also features, for example, very prominently in the Canadian foreign policy, the Canadian International Development Policy, FIAB. And then the third claim is the local peacebuilding efforts, which also has a claim geared towards effectiveness. So if there will be more grassroots women peacebuilding efforts, that would have a positive impact on local peacebuilding. So these are instrumentalist claims which dominate the narrative, and that's what we wanted to test with a systematic review. The methodology is we followed the established protocols on how to do a systematic review. So we designed the protocol, did pre-register that protocol. We searched in academic databases with the help of our research librarian of Marcela Guzman. Then we did a hand search of websites of major multilateral organizations, of the largest NGOs, international development NGOs mainly, and then of, I think it's 12 bilateral donors. So we went to their websites and searched for any kind of paper relating to WPS and instrumentalist claims. That took us a long time to search that, and we found the first results. It was very, very daunting. First results were 45,000 hits. So at some point, you're confronted with 45,000 references, which you then have to screen. By screening, I mean that we have to check whether the papers we identify meet our inclusion criteria, which are predefined, right? So the inclusion criteria were only English, published between 2001, so the year would be when the WPS, 1 year after Resolution 1325, for 20 years. The studies had to explore one of the 3 instrumental claims, which I mentioned before. And then the studies had to use a research design suitable for causal inference, which is a very high barrier, because very few research designs are suitable for causal inference. So causal inference meaning that we can actually attribute an outcome to an intervention. And that is the usual criteria in systematic reviews, but we soon realized that if we had that threshold, we would end up with only 2 studies. So we considerably lowered that threshold. And in the end, we included every study which had some primary data and explained that primary data. So it's a very low barrier, right? Studies in English, exploring the claim and including primary data. That could be focus group interviews, it could be surveys, it could be even participatory observation in the country, but it could not be a literature review or a purely theoretical paper. So it's a very low threshold for a quality claim, but we had to do this because otherwise the search would have been empty. The screening, 45,000 studies screened for title and abstract. You do this you can do this on your device. So 8 people sitting for I don't know how many hours, and then screen, no, yes, no, yes. And when you screen this, one thing you have to do is there have been, 2 people have to agree that this should be included, so that we minimize bias. So basically, it was 90,000 studies to screen between our 8 people. So you understand why it took us a long time. Then once you boil it down to the studies which are promising, which you need to read in order to understand whether or not they should be included, that resulted in 180 studies, which we then read in full text, and only 16 were included. So that's disappointing. That is really disappointing, but it is what it is, right? And there were periods when we were thinking that, we've been working on this for 4 months and we find nothing. That is really frustrating. But on the other hand, if you find nothing, that's also a result, right? It is in a way also important to point out to, hey, there is no evidence, and that is basically our work as social scientists. That's what, if we don't do that, then who else does it, right? So that's when we decided, okay, let's move forward with that and tease out everything we can from these 16 studies, which we did in the report, which you can access from the website. But in a nutshell, the main result is still this: there is no evidence for the 3 instrumentalist claims. There is simply no evidence, right? And that corroborates a finding by 3IE, which is I would say 3IE is the #1 think tank for systematic reviews in international development. And it just published, I think 2 weeks ago, a massive systematic review on empowerment. So it's slightly different, but they also tackled the question of, are there direct links between development interventions and peace outcomes? So development intervention and female empowerment and peace outcomes, and they couldn't find anything. So that also increases our confidence that there is really no evidence, right? There's one caveat. There's 2 ways of making sense of the finding that there's no evidence. One is there cannot be evidence because the theoretical assumptions about causality are flawed. So we shouldn't in the first place assume that we would find any evidence, right? So if the theoretical assumption is flawed, that you include women as peacekeepers, and then, for whatever reason, theoretical reasons, peacekeeping becomes better. If that theory is flawed, then it's no surprise that we don't find anything. So that's one way of thinking. The other way of thinking is we didn't find evidence because the current research is too weak. And with better evidence, we may be able to find more evidence. So I'm not saying that there will never ever be evidence, right? We still have these options, but for now there's none. Right? And then the major implications is that public policies, that means as public policy in the sense as long as someone spends money, right, in the WPS field, that should not be based on instrumentalist claims because there's no evidence for that. So one of the implications we then have is then maybe we should pivot to rights-based approaches, and that's the panel discussion. That's the thing we want to discuss. If you agree with these findings, and you don't have to, but I will also say that it's pretty hard to contradict the report, of that magnitude. But I'll leave that to the panelists. But if you agree that there's very little evidence, so is then a consequence to really pivot the way we think and what we do to rights-based approaches? And that's the questions I would like to discuss. So these are the questions then, right? Should we indeed abandon instrumentalist claims or not? And then should indeed policies pivot to rights-based approaches, which is what we suggest in the report, but which is also what we want to discuss. But if we did that, then how would that look like, right? What is a rights-based approach specifically and in action for peacekeeping, for grassroots peace building, and for peace negotiation? So that's the frame of the panel discussion. And I'll stop here. I will unshare my screen. And I would like to move on to our panel discussions, to the panelists. And the first round would be, it's the same question. The first to answer would be Eileen, and then Laura, and then Kathleen. Then the second round, reverse the order. The question is this, it's a number of questions. Are you surprised by these findings or not, right? And do you agree that we should abandon instrumentalist claims? And do you also agree or not that maybe we should pivot to rights-based approaches? Eileen, you have the floor, please.
Thank you. Merci. Bonjour. Hello, Kwe, everyone. Thanks for inviting me to this panel. First of all, I would like to thank the research team. It's really important to take a critical view at this. It was well needed and it's helpful for our work. That being said, I'm not surprised by your results. When I started working on the WPS agenda in 2017 at Global Affairs Canada, everyone kept claiming that survivors of sexual violence, men and women, were more likely to report the violation to a woman officer. And this claim was used to support the argument that we needed more women in peace operations to address both sexual exploitation and abuse and sexual and gender and conflict-related sexual and gender-based violence. And when I looked into this claim, it turned out that it was based on one single study from the US, from the domestic context, possibly only from one precinct. So not the conflict situation where the claim was used to support this argument that more women in peace operations would make us more efficient in addressing sexual exploitation and abuse and conflict-related sexual violence. I have, however, cited one of the studies that you included in your review up till recently, and I will be careful before I do so again after reading your report. Obviously, we should not make these claims without a good basis for them and without looking into the research backing them. However, when we do have basis for these claims, I think they can be important. In some circumstances, these arguments are more likely to fall well with the interlocutors than the rights-based argument, in particular in cases where gender equality is perceived as a Western concept. That being said, in most cases, we already and increasingly stress the rights-based approach, not as much because of a lack of evidence as for the fact that women shouldn't have to prove their usefulness or their added value to participate. No one asks why men are allowed to participate in peace negotiations. It is women's rights to participate equally with men in decision-making processes generally, and to have their say in decisions that affect them. And this is the argument that we use increasingly at Global Affairs Canada. And the rights-based approach is already a strong part of the WPS agenda. As you know, the rights-based approach derives from the Forward Conferences on Women and the movement that resulted in CEDAW and the Beijing Platform for Action, which were the basis for the advocacy and efforts that resulted in Security Council Resolution 1325. Lots of good work is already being done. Also to further the human rights-based argument, and not only by Canada and our partners, but but more broadly. That's it for me for the opening statement. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Elin. Next is Laura.
All right. Hello, everyone. So to echo Eileen, thank you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion and the Q&A. And also thank you to the team for such an important contribution to our understanding on women in peacekeeping and peace building, as this is surely going to help shape our research moving forward. So generally, to answer your first question of was I surprised by the findings, I would agree that generally I was not very surprised by the findings for a few reasons, some of which are going to kind of echo what we've already heard. So on one hand, I think we have kind of long recognized that many of the assumptions underlying these instrumentalist claims are based on gender stereotypes that in of themselves may undermine gender equality and attempts to integrate women into these peacekeeping and peace building processes. This includes things like, for example, assuming that women are going to be automatically better at addressing sexual violence or be more concerned about women's rights, and instead, focusing more the discussion on things like training and experiences instead of just assuming that because they are female, they're going to be more concerned about women. So I think on one hand, that was one reason I wasn't necessarily surprised. Secondly, I also think in a larger context or sense, a lot of the instrumentalist claims tend to kind of understate the importance of the larger gendered nature of peacekeeping missions and peace building initiatives, obscuring things like masculinity and the role of masculinity within the behavior of many of these types of missions, as well as all the hierarchies that women, as well as not only gendered hierarchies, but racialized hierarchies that are built into these peacekeeping and peace building initiatives that can make it difficult for female peacekeepers to act or assert their agency, even if there was any type of different way that they may act relative to men. So generally, that would kind of summarize why I wasn't necessarily surprised. As far as kind of pivoting to a rights-based approach. So I think this would definitely be in line with a lot of the recognitions that has long been within the research, as well as in much of the policy making about the concern for a double burden on female peacekeepers. I really like Nina Willen has a quote where she says that we don't assume that male peacekeepers have to have an added value. So why do we assume that women do to have to justify their participation in peacekeeping and peace building, that they should participate just because it is their right, as well as the right of women to be represented within these institutions. And then I think kind of the last thing that I'd like to touch on before I pass it along to Kathleen is also kind of an acknowledgement that within 1325, it's not only recognized that women can be effective and offer this unique perspective, but that to do so, we have to remove those barriers to meaningful participation. So I think before we can even understand if women were to have a unique impact or any type of different impact, we would have to first have those barriers removed, which we know, of course, there are many barriers both within home countries as well as on missions that are going to limit women's possible contribution, their meaningful participation, and lead to marginalization and exclusion as well. So I think moving forward, we also have to consider that larger context when we are looking at the impact of female peacekeepers and peace builders. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm taking notes here, but I just want to stress two things. The one is to remove barriers, which I think is extremely important, and I think we're getting back to that in in the third round when we talk about policy implications, and that would be indeed one of my my most pressing questions. What kind of international, and it will probably be international development policies, would be up to the task to mitigate those barriers a little bit, because it's not an easy question, right? It's a bit difficult one. And the other thing I want to flag out is the gender stereotypes, which you rightly mentioned that some of the the alleged causal mechanisms are based on very often based on gender stereotypes. But the interesting thing here is that as you write in the report, grassroots organizations were more effective in contexts where such gender stereotypes or traditional roles actually enabled a larger participation. So in Papua New Guinea or the Solomon Island, you had these structures and which created space. Right? Whereas in culturally more, I don't know how to put the right word, more restrained context like South Sudan, there's no space at all. So the space that we found for grassroots peace building actually was created by kind of gender stereotypes. So that's an interesting ambiguity. And yeah, thank you for bringing up Nina Villen. We quote her in the report also with that citation. And I didn't know that if Kathleen Jennings hadn't told me about Nina Villen. So you should also know that when I started this research, I reached out to Kathleen because I read her very early paper on peacekeeping. I was very impressed and asked her for help. And she was gracious enough to offer us that help and support. So Kathleen, you have the floor.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's really nice to be here, and I appreciated very much reading the report and also talking to your students last spring about this. And I mean, I guess I should say, following up on what Christoph just said about this report, or not even, a little policy brief that I wrote back in 2011, thereabouts, about women in peacekeeping. I think I called it something like agents of change or stranded symbols. I don't know, something very dramatic. And the point of that policy brief was essentially to lay out, not to do any kind of, I mean, this brief wouldn't be included and was not included in this review because there was no primary, there was no like data collection or anything. It was just more of a, I guess you might call it a conceptual scoping device of kind of summarizing some of the arguments put forth for increasing women's participation in peacekeeping operations, and some of the implications of these arguments. And I wrote that. It was a commissioned research report. Promptly forgot about it until I got this email last spring from Christoph, and was slightly horrified to find. And of course, I read Nina's work, and of course, I'm keeping up on this, but it hadn't occurred to me how little, I guess, research had been done to actually kind of test these claims that I outlined in this report I did. Until Christoph reached out and basically presented this project and told me how relatively little material research was out there. And so I wasn't surprised, much like Ellen and Laura, I wasn't surprised at the findings of the report. I was surprised at how, and this is not meant as a critique of my fellow researchers, but I was surprised at how little the research agenda has moved forward in the 10 years since I wrote that report. But I mean, taking a step back, I mean, it's not that surprising because these claims are really hard to test. I don't even know how you would go about doing that. And this gets to what Laura was saying. I mean, a lot of these claims are based on, essentially gender stereotypes, or I think Alyssa Helms called them affirmative gender essentialisms, which I really like. And so it's very then difficult to figure out how you're going to actually find evidence for or against these. So if you're looking at the claim that women are less confrontational and aggressive, like women police officers, or I guess you could think to yourself, well, how would we actually test that? And when I say test, I mean, I'm a qualitative researcher, so take everything I say in terms of proxies and tests and this now with a grain of salt. But if I were to design a research project where I was attempting to ascertain the veracity of a claim regarding women's less confrontational manner, how would I do that? Well, if I wanted to look at police, maybe I could say women arrests versus proportionally women police officers arresting versus men proportionally, complaints against women police officers for abuse or for violence against citizens versus men, stuff like that. You don't have this information in your peacekeeping operations. It's not available. I mean, to some degree, yeah, they do report on various things, but I mean, first of all, it's hard to access. It's very spotty, and so what you end up finding then in these situations, and this is very clear in the report, is that you end up getting a lot of perceptions, reporting on peacekeepers' own perceptions of their own behavior or how the locals perceive them, or locals' perceptions of women peacekeepers versus men, and that's completely interesting stuff to read, and then can be very good, interesting stuff, but it's not easy to do, and it doesn't get us very far in terms of either proving or debunking these kind of claims. So I guess I would say that that I would have liked if we could have come a bit further. I feel like this the kind of research community, I guess I should say, because it feels like there's a lot of reliance on these kind of arguments for why women peacekeepers are, I'm focusing specifically on peacekeepers here, peacekeepers are important and what they bring and stuff like that. And I mean, it's just a bit lazy, and yet it's very hard to figure out if these claims have merit or not, based on just the difficulty of testing these claims, and also based on the sort of access that people have to these missions, to the material, to any kind of data that could allow you to test, and of course. Doing fieldwork in these places can be very, well, it's obviously very time and resource intensive, but it also can be very increasingly difficult to get any kind of decent access to these missions as well. So I mean, I think when it gets to the bigger question of whether or not there should be a pivot towards rights-based approaches, I mean, yes. From my own personal point of view, I've always thought that, and this is again what Laura was referring to, Nina's approach here is that we shouldn't be having to argue about this. But I mean, I think the bigger issue is, what do we gain and what do we lose from pivoting to from a kind of instrumentalist to a kind of rights-based argumentation in relation to, again, specifically on peacekeeping, because I don't think it's the quality of the argumentation that's driving the way peacekeeping operations look. It's the reality of troop contributing countries and the composition of their militaries. That's what drives the way peacekeeping operations look. Of course, there are civilian peacekeeping operations, but peacekeeping operations are heavily military and police. So in that respect, it's I think it's more useful to ask, what are the harms of depending on an instrumentalist, potential harms of depending on an instrumentalist approach? What are the potential benefits of pivoting to a rights approach? And does it actually, in terms of peacekeeping, does it actually matter that much given the systemic constraints to, if you want to say, diversifying or regendering peacekeeping? So I personally would prefer a rights-based approach, but I'm also very cognizant of people in the systems who feel that they need to use instrumentalist-based arguments in order to create a more convincing environment for increasing women's participation. So that's my introduction.
Thank you very much. One aspect I would like to come back to at some point, if we have time, is really the question of, you said you felt that the research community should have more advanced over the last 10 years, but we didn't. And I really wonder why. Partially it's because it's difficult, but I feel that's not the only answer. So there must be something going on there why the research is slower than it should be. So that's one question. And the other thing is obviously also should we retain instrumentalist claims as a strategy B to convince people who are hard to convince by a rights-based approach. So that's another thing. I just take note of interesting things for the second round. And the second round of question is, before I do this, I want to ask you panelists, do you want to react to each other at if anything that came to mind that you think you want to, a quick reaction?
Not at this point for me.
All right, then I suggest we move on to the second question, which is specifically how would the rights-based approach then look like? So we have these three domains. One is peacekeeping, and I think the answer could be relatively simple for peacekeeping, but it gets much more complicated for formal peace negotiations, and it gets most complicated for grassroots peace building, partly because of the barriers that Laura mentioned. So, but if we take this seriously, right? So say as a thought experiment, we pivot towards rights-based approach, but we want to see manifest that in our policies. What would it look like, right? So, pick any of the three fields: peacekeeping, or formal peace negotiations, or grassroots peacekeeping. How would it look like? I would like to start with Laura, and then Elin, and then Kathleen.
Sure. This is, of course, a really important question. I will mostly be speaking about peacekeeping, as that's what I know best. And I think kind of connecting to this directly with the question about the barriers to women's participation in peacekeeping. So for some background, I was involved with the Measuring Opportunities for Women in Peacekeeping project that was part of the ELSI initiative, and it was done by DCAF along with Sabrina Karim at Cornell. And in this project, we categorized 10 major barriers for women to join peacekeeping missions and to meaningfully participate. And these barriers spanned everything from selection criteria that's set by the UN, by the troop or police contributing country, gender roles within the country, as well as the gender norms within the institution, whether military or police institution as well, and the eligible pool, kind of going back to what Kathleen had mentioned about whether or not there are even women to deploy in the military or police forces of the troop and police contributing countries. And generally, we often found, and if anyone is interested, these reports are available on the DCAF website. But one thing that we found that kind of kept coming up was that some of the most prominent barriers related to things like gender roles and to the culture of the institutions itself, and whether women were being excluded from networks within the police and military institution. And in a way, this not only is about the right of women to participate in peacekeeping, but the right of women to fully and meaningfully participate within these careers that they've chosen to be able to advance within the police or military within their country. And sometimes deploying to a peacekeeping mission is a vital step in that career progression. And that varies across countries, but sometimes that's almost a requirement to be able to be promoted later on. And so I think within peacekeeping and this rights-based approach, there is an opportunity to connect it not just with their right to be deployed to peacekeeping missions, but with their right to have kind of fulfilling careers and to be able to reach their full potential within their home institution as well. And I think within this, it's not just the responsibility of the UN or the responsibility of the host or of the troop or police contributing country. And that's where it gets difficult because both have to be acting together at the same time. That's something that in my research I've heard sometimes the troop or police contributing country feels frustrated by what the UN has been doing. And sometimes the UN feels frustrated the other way. And so I think there has to be more coordination and support between the different institutions to kind of help move forward with the rights-based argument. And I'll stop there for now, but I'm happy to talk more on this. I know I picked a very specific slice of it.
Thank you so much. There's tons of things I'd like to come back, but before that, I think Elin, it's your turn. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Well, as I mentioned, at GAC, we already do take a rights-based approach to peacekeeping, to women in peacekeeping, to women in peace negotiations, and to women in peace building. We realize the limits of this argument in many contexts, especially where it matters the most, and not least when it comes to local peace building initiatives. And so we have to look at the barriers, like Laura discussed for women in peacekeeping. The argument really takes us to that point where we need to address the barriers. And to some extent, we do that through Canada's National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, where we work with colleagues across GAC, so colleagues responsible for development programming, for example, they work on girls' access to education, women's access to justice, and women's participation in political processes, etc. And we hope that changes in these fields will translate in the long run to more opportunities and larger spaces for women to participate in peace negotiations and peace building efforts. We also argue, and I think you mentioned that in the report, that peace negotiations offer an opportunity to achieve greater gender equality in the post-war society and more respect for women's human rights. And that in turn, based on some studies, would increase stability. So that's an argument that we usually use. And finally, I think we tend to have a broader concept of peace than you do in your study, especially as Canada's National Action Plan has increased its domestic reach. So we look at peace and security more as a security concept, so security for women and girls and marginalized groups, rather than peace as the absence of armed conflict. And there has been some interesting work done on that. There are some indicators measuring how people perceive peace and security on a daily basis. So I think we would likely include some of the activities that you in the report call service delivery, we would probably include in how we view peace building. And that of course affects also the way we look at some of these studies that you reviewed. So that's just a few points from me on how we approach the argument. Thanks.
Thank you. Kathleen, you have the floor.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, this is interesting. And I want to pick up a little bit on what Laura was talking about. And the work of that project was really good, very interesting. Recommend to read those reports. But in terms of, the sending militaries and the kind of barriers, I mean, you see this as well when, and this gets to the whole, like, how do you test these claims? I mean, if you have a claim, again, I'm going to pick up on the women being less violent, or maybe women are, I don't know, magically able to stop sexual violence or through their womanness, I don't know, whatever. Sorry, I'm being a little bit sarcastic, but I think one thing as well that we have to keep in mind is that just because women are in peacekeeping operations as peacekeepers doesn't mean they have any interaction with the local population. I mean, Sabrina talked about this in her paper that was covered in the report. She called it the access gap, I think. So when I was doing my fieldwork in, oh God, where was this? I guess Liberia. There was a Nigerian battalion that was very proud of the amount of women in its battalion. It had a group of, I think they were of between 15 and 20 women, and they were very pleased with this, and fair enough. And these women who I spoke to all of them and had spent a very lovely afternoon with them. I think part of their responsibilities were to entertain visiting female researchers writing about gender and peacekeeping. They certainly seemed very used to that task, but they were entirely administrative, and that's fine. But they were entirely doing support work in the compound, in the office. They were living in the compound where they worked. They had very little contact with the people around, with library people. And that's not actually unusual. There are a lot of people who work in peacekeeping operations who have a very limited contact with the people in the community where they live. But it's kind of important to keep in mind that when countries, for example, are reporting on how many women they're sending into peacekeeping operations, that doesn't always necessarily tell you very much about what their roles and responsibilities are. So that is also something that I think can be kept in mind. And again, makes testing these claims even more difficult because, again, you don't have many, you just don't have many opportunities to test these claims because you don't have that many women peacekeepers on the military and police side. And the kind of tasks we're doing may not actually be what you want to test in a way, what you're concerned about finding out. If we get to the actual question that I was asked to answer in terms of what would a rights-based approach look like in terms of peacekeeping, if we were to kind of pivot. I mean, I guess I would say that, I mean, a lot of this is being done in peacekeeping operations. And I mean, peacekeeping operations are pretty complex environments where you do have different arguments and different discourses being used for different elements of the peacekeeping operation. And the people who are doing human rights and rule of law and gender and civil society work will talk about women's participation differently. I mean, and okay, there may be not as much on the security side, but by virtue of being in a peacekeeping operation, they're a part of the women, peace, and security agenda. But in terms of the actual operationalization of peacekeeping, I mean, you can talk all you want about the importance of instrumentalist arguments in arguing for why women should be in peacekeeping, but that argument really happens, I mean, that happens before you get into the peacekeeping operation. Once you're there, the focus, you really shouldn't be arguing for why women should be there in the first place because they're there. You could maybe be arguing about why women in the host society should be integrated into the police training and the security sector reform and stuff. But I think what you tend to see is that there is, as Laura was sort of referring to, there is this constant perceived need to justify women's existence in these operations, and to the extent that, I mean, and again, I appreciate this need, but to the extent that can cause problems is if you're so dependent on making these kind of instrumentalist arguments, what happens if people call you out on it? Or if people just don't believe you? Or if people say, do you have proof for that? The more you depend on putting forth a reason for why women or any group should be treated equally, the more you're setting yourself up for removing those protections and that equal treatment if they don't prove their worth. So in a peacekeeping operation itself, though, I mean, the thing is that UN is, everything that happens in the UN is basically first and foremost grounded in rights-based arguments. The instrumentalist arguments are a way of selling it, in my experience at least. So I guess the question would be, what are we trying to sell? And why do we feel the need to sell women's participation? And of course, we have to sell it because the UN depends on contributions of member states, and to the extent that they need to be convinced that they should be bringing up women, that could be useful. But I mean, taking a step back, I think there are benefits to using these instrumentalist type arguments. In a way, it can solve problems for people in terms of how they are trying to kind of speak the language of the people, their audiences and interlocutors. But there are also potential harms in setting yourself up for a problem that shouldn't actually exist.
Thank you so much. I just want to remind the audience that in maybe 10 minutes or so, 5 minutes, we will, well, the floor is open. You can already post Q&A, but in maybe 5 minutes or so, I will start picking questions from you. So please feel free to start posting questions in the Q&A or then to raise your hands. Before we do that, I want to get back to some of the points that were just made. And one question is that when we did this research and thought about the peacekeeping, a question that I'm really struggling with is this. So the rich North, that's us, is implementing policies so that the poor South, which are the only countries who are sending peacekeepers, right, is sending more women, right? Rich countries, there's one exception. There's one wealthy country that sends peacekeepers in the field, and that is China, right? But wealthy countries of the North, they don't send their men, they don't send the women. But so we have these initiatives like the ELSI initiative in Canada, which is basically a way to incentivize countries like Bangladesh or Ghana or Ethiopia to set more women as peacekeepers. And in a way that I thought that's it. For me, that makes me a little bit uneasy. And maybe I'm the only one who, feels that uneasiness. But I wanted to just ask you, maybe Laura and Eileen, all of you actually, how do you deal with this?
I guess I can start off. So I think this is a really important point and speaks to the larger kind of hierarchical context of peacekeeping that is just a fact that we have to navigate when we have these conversations. And one thing that we often, in the MOIT, for example, in that project, always emphasized is the difference between kind of the raw numbers of women and the percentages of women that are being sent. And that some countries can have very high percentages of women, but maybe that translates to only 5 women. And then some countries may be sending hundreds of women, but it's a relatively low percentage. So just when we're talking about the implications of things like having targets as for the percentage of female peacekeepers, that has very different implications for the number that are going to be sent and how that's going to be navigated in each troop and police contributing country. I think an additional thought that came to mind as you were talking about this question is additionally concerns as to the level of safety for the women and for the men, but particularly for the women that are being sent when you're thinking about things like sexual harassment or sexual assault that may be happening both within the police and military as the selection process is happening, and whether or not they're being subject to any type of quid pro quo type policy or type interaction as the selection is happening. But then as well once they're deployed, whether or not there are any types of increased risk for sexual harassment or assault that are happening for the female peacekeepers. And so keeping in mind that we are oftentimes making this argument that we should send female peacekeepers as protectors of local women, but making sure that in that process, we are not increasing their own risk within institutions that also tend to be highly masculine and unsafe for women oftentimes.
Thank you. Eileen, would you like to react? To Kathleen, would you like to react?
Well, I agree with Lara. It's a very important question. Thanks for raising it. Unfortunately, I think it's part of a bigger question about our programming, our international assistance programming, and our foreign policy, like whether and to what extent it's just another expression of our colonialist attitudes of telling other people what to do. So it almost becomes a philosophical question. But it's very well, it's a very good point. But of course, I don't have an answer to it.
Thank you, Kathleen.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, I mean, and I agree, it's it's an important discussion. I guess I would say that, like Laura pointed out, this kind of hierarchy is sort of built into peacekeeping. It's also built into the WPS agenda. And this has been something that our colleagues and activists from the Global South have been saying from day one. And this is something that is, I mean, I'm from the US, but I live and work in Norway, and Norway is one of the sort of leading countries in terms of the WPS and certainly a leading donor. But as soon as the mirror gets turned on itself, things get a bit stickier. Norway doesn't meet its targets in relation to women in its own national military, much less in relation to deployment of women peacekeepers. Norway deploys very few peacekeepers, but so it's, yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that is, I think we just have to be self-critical, and well, we who are sitting in this position have to be certainly sort of reflexive and critical about how we talk about and try to understand these things. And certainly, I mean, of course, it does also create, I mean, the whole all these narrative agendas are essentially minefields in a way of these kind of ethical challenges and problems, because there is certainly a degree of, as Ed was saying, colonialist or sort of mentality of do as we say, not as we do. That is very much an issue here as well.
Thank you. I have another question to Eileen. If your budget would be increased by, I don't know, a factor of 20 by tomorrow. So, you know, the prime minister came to you and said, your budget is increased. Spend as much as you want, right? I'm just wondering, what would be the ideal initiative to spend the money? What kind of grassroots organization would you think would have the most impact, or would you spend it on formal peace negotiations? What would you do if you had these bags of money?
I know exactly what I would do. I would increase our funding to grassroots organizations. It's something that's really difficult for Global Affairs Canada to do because of the very strict budget rules and the fiduciary duties that we have towards taxpayers. So it's very complicated to ask Global Affairs Canada for money. Local grassroots organizations have no chance in this process. We have some ways. We have the Canada Fund for Local Initiatives, for example, where our missions abroad have a pot of money with much less stricter requirements. But even so, I was once talking to a woman peacebuilder from South Sudan who was looking for funding for a project, and I asked her, well, have you gone to the Canadian Embassy and asked for CFLI funding? And she said, yes, but they told me I had to do something called GBA plus analysis. Which is for her was an obstacle, was a barrier. She couldn't even apply. She, her access to the internet was, she used WhatsApp and that's pretty much it. So she couldn't even read up on that. And why do we ask a woman peace builder to provide a GBA plus analysis for her project? It's ridiculous. So I think I would create a fund that's even less strict, that is not risk averse, and that gives people a chance. We have very good examples of such small fundings. I think Leila Magobi received a $5,000 grant when she started out her peace work, bringing peace to her country from the Norwegian some church or something. And then so sometimes it doesn't take much to start a process, to start a movement even. So that's definitely what I would do, and I wouldn't be so worried about evidence. And I wouldn't be so worried about risks, because you have to take some risk if you want to win. So that's what I would do. Thank you.
And I think, as I said, sometimes it really doesn't take that much. I think money is often, I mean, it's a problem to find ways to spend it, but what I'm trying to say is that it's often not the big costly initiatives that have impact, but very often it's the small targeted one, and match the money with the people who want to do things with it. That's, at least that's my experience. At this point, and I will ask you, all the panelists, is this something I should have asked you, or something you wanna just like still mention? Please, just whatever comes to mind, whatever you think you should want to add to the discussion.
I thought we had one more question, Christoph.
Yeah, we kind of linked it together with the second one, as you know, because we moved already to policy implication. The third one was really specific policy initiatives, and in a way, you just very beautifully answered that with you want to have a fund for unbureaucratic fund for grassroots organizations. But yes, I mean the third question is definitely the specific policies you would like to see on the ground. So Laura, Kathleen, you have want to weigh in on this, or Elin as well?
I guess so. Again, coming from the perspective of someone who's done a lot of work with military and police forces and kind of that side of the peacekeeping question, I think one specific policy that would be helpful is much more focus on things like training, both on ensuring that men and women have access to gendered training, not just on one hand assuming that all women already have the necessary knowledge to do gendered type tasks, but also having men have access to these trainings as well, and women. And also larger training so that women have the skills necessary to deploy. Things like being able to drive an automatic car, maybe something that women may not have, and it's kind of a hidden barrier for them to deploy. So helping to even out training opportunities for men and women that can then lead to deployment opportunities in general, and then also better service provision on those deployments as well. And then kind of a thing I always end up coming back to is just more policies that focus specifically on gendered cultures within these institutions rather than on men and women, but looking at this larger take on gender norms, practices, and cultures in the institutions. But that's not a specific policy. That's a much broader one. But
so there's one thing I didn't understand. You said better service provisions. What do you mean by that?
So I guess I should be a bit more specific with that. So with better service, I was thinking about things like when peacekeepers try to address sexual assault or provide trainings for like local women, being sure that they actually are trained to do that type of work that they're doing. But even more broader than service provision, just training to do their job as peacekeepers.
I'm making a list of the things that should be done, starting with the grassroots funding, and it's a long list already. It's a good list. Kathleen, what should I add to the list of the policies that need to be done?
I'm not sure this is actually a policy implication because I have a hard time imagining how this would work, but I do wish that there would be a little bit more reflection or less kind of knee-jerk going to the perceived need to use instrumentalist arguments. I kind of think that a lot of people feel like they need to use these arguments to appeal to the military guy sitting at the table. I mean, I've known a lot of military guys in my time, and I grew up, and I'm a third generation military kid myself. And, you know, they don't necessarily need these arguments. And in fact, my experience of military people, whether from the global north or global south, is they're much more willing to take on board arguments that they don't feel are maybe, well, I'm not going to say full of you know what, but I mean, if they're being told something by someone that doesn't match up to their own experience, then they're much more willing to dismiss it. So if they're being told that women are more effective at X, Y, and Z, and they don't have that in their own experience, maybe because they've never seen women doing these tasks, then that might not be the convincing argument you think it is. Yeah. So I guess I would say that, and it's not, of course, only military people that use these. I mean, the Norwegian Prime Minister stands up and uses operational effectiveness arguments when she's trying to convince Norwegian girls to join the military. So this is an argument that is by no means restricted to people trying to appeal to military audiences. But I think that there is a knee-jerk tendency to assume that if you're going to get through to the big scary guy sitting around the table with, you know, his military uniform on, that you have to couch it in this language of operational effectiveness. I don't know that that's true, and I really wish that there would be less of a tendency to feel the need to do that, because I do think it is counterproductive. Yeah.
If I might quickly add to that, I actually tend to think now that it's counterproductive to use this argument, because I'm telling you why I do think that. I do know that NATO had a known project on that specific question of operation effectiveness. There was a study being commissioned, and I was in touch with the author of that study, and we exchanged experiences. And from what she told me is that she also couldn't find any evidence. So the paper would have been presented to NATO, right? So that means the military press has already, in a way, proved that instrumentalism doesn't work. It's just that NATO never published the paper because they buried it somewhere. But you know, if people already think that, then it really doesn't make sense then from the research community coming. But you know, instrumentalist claims are actually good. So it even, you know, it may create a disconnect. So I personally think it's a smarter strategy to say, you know, rights-based approach. A few things which we don't have to justify in instrumentalist terms. But that's just my 2 cents. Elin, I think I see you on the floor.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to add a couple of things, because while we will continue to stress the rights-based approach, the reality is that our politicians are very keen to have data and evidence back up our policies and programming. So we will keep looking at evidence for this, and I think we need to look at the broader security concept that I discussed before. I think we need to look at research on gender equality and stability, on inclusive decision making. I think that's very relevant, instead of just looking very narrowly at peace negotiations, for example. And we also know this is not the only area where it's very hard to demonstrate results. We know how hard it is to show any results of the work we do at Global Affairs. If we fund a project to you know, include women in a peace hut in West Africa, and then 5 years later we have peace in that country, how do we know if our project contributed to that peace or not? It's impossible. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't fund that project, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't keep looking for evidence. And maybe and it's important, because if we can't improve what we don't measure. So I think we still have to keep trying. And the lack of evidence could also be underfunding. So, maybe the international community has relied on this simple argumentation instead of investing the necessary resources. And actually, we took this, based on this, we actually launched a new WPS Awards program this year at Global Affairs. And one component there is a research award. So we work with IDRC on this. And the theme this year is Women Peacebuilders. So I'm very keen to see where that research, what that research will result in. But there will be two new research projects supported through this awards program that will look at women peacebuilders. So hopefully they will come up with something. But I think that why we, I believe that the rights-based approach is strong in itself, but additional research can help us shape our support better, shape our interventions better. And I think that's really important.
Thank you. One thing that also I find really interesting listening to all of you is, that list which we just established in a way, but also other things you said before, all points to slower incremental steps aiming at not quick gains, right? But long-term stuff. So Laura was talking about changing institutions in a way, but including men and women and training and going, very much upstream by training for, how to drive the car, for example, right? Or when we talked about barriers, Ili mentioned things like, I believe, better economic opportunities for women, better representation, better, more participation in elections. That's very much upstream, and it's long-term. That's probably also something that, it's, I believe that's exactly right, but I think it's difficult to sell that to policymakers who want to see quick gains all the time. We have 15 minutes left, and I'd like to, unless you want to jump in right now and say, say something important, that's by all means do. But I would like to open up the floor to questions from the audience. You can either raise your hands, and I believe our technician will help us identify raised hands, or you can post questions in the chat. There are already two questions in the chat which are directed to me, and I will quickly answer those. The one is, so you find that when you click on the little Q&A icon in your browser. So one question is a method. My question is, that's from Benedict Santoir. My question is methodological. How and why did you choose the criteria of exclusion on a positivist causal basis? That's easy to answer. I didn't choose that. That was, we wanted to test instrumentalist claims out there. So the claims are out there, and these claims are, they're positivist causal basis. When a claim says, add women to peacekeeping makes peace better, that is a causal claim, right? So I took this claim for what they are, causal claims. I wanted to test those. So that wasn't really, that wasn't us. That was the claims there. And then the other one is from Cornelia Weiss. Would you be willing to address how the research reviewed research did not meet the causal inference threshold? We lowered that threshold, right? If we had stuck to that threshold, we would have ended up with two studies, and studies that meet that threshold are studies which either explicitly or implicitly have a counterfactual. So they compare an aspect of a peacekeeping mission with women and an aspect with a peacekeeping mission without women, and they have a measurement for the outcome. So there is one study in the sample who does exactly that. So it is possible to do this, right? It's just very, very few studies. But since so very few studies did that, we lowered the threshold, and it's now way lower than causal inference. As I said, we included every study that asked a question about these claims and then had primary data. That data is not necessarily geared towards answering a causal question. It's not necessarily the counterfactual. But as soon as they had causal, some empirical data, so I went to the field and I ran 10 interviews, or I had a mini survey, or I participated in a peacekeeping operation for 2 weeks and took notes. So that's primary data. So everything that had that was included. And it's still only 16 studies, which really brings me back to Kathleen's point. And you said the word, we as a research community are probably a bit lazy, and I think that's exactly it. We are. I mean, we could do better, right?
I didn't say we're lazy. I said
Oh,
some
I
of the
think
assumptions are lazy.
Oh, right. Okay. I apologize. You didn't say, okay, let me say it. I do think that much of the research in that field is a bit lazy. And, you know, if we're going to make a meaningful contribution to help ELIN spend all that money for grassroots organizations, we better have some research to have some criteria where the money is well spent. So I do think we can do better.
We have Margaret Jenkins who's ready to ask for a question.
Excellent.
Hi there, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we have some. Please tell to whom the question is going.
Yeah, sure. Just to the panel. I do work on gender barrier assessments and peacekeeping. I mean, when this, I'd just like to hear what you think of a comment I have, whether you agree or have something to add. On funding, to the question to Hélène, like what we should spend money on, seems to me we need, like, if the military took gender equality seriously, or gender issues such as ending military related sexual assault, or tackling these barriers, like if I had more money, I would definitely, there should be a huge research and development component on that kind of research, given the amount of money that goes into, now this new arms race on hypersonic missiles. Meanwhile, we have military sexual assault, and we always, in all the recommendations of the reports, we talk about training, but we really don't know which gender training works. We need randomized control trials. We need like sophisticated quantitative and qualitative, research and collection of baseline data and tracking. And, so I think I'd like to hear what, their thoughts are on that. And and I guess just in my work, I'd like to say I think researchers have been debunking instrumentalist claims now, like for 2 decades, and they're still being used. I mean, I wrote a paper, same thing, Georgetown Institute of Women, Peace and Security in 2010 on this. It was already being debunked. And I think if you work in places like I do in Asia, having it still resonates for advocacy reasons. So this gets to a big tension between research and advocacy. And that's been far too blurred in women, peace and security. And hopefully that's being looked at more, but it still resonates. We're talking about regions where you still have combat bans, you still have a lot of discomfort. It's still very much up in the air where if women have a right to inclusion in these military schools, they don't have it right now. So then, the UN is in a tough bind because they want to raise the numbers, but their TCCs and, countries, they don't have these institutions. They're not there yet in terms of that rights-based argument resonating in some extent. But I could go on because it gets to the uneasiness that you talked to, Christopher, and I totally agree with that, because we may have the money, but we certainly don't have the numbers ourselves on it, and we don't have the moral high ground. So when I say this, I say it, this is global, global, like the rights argument can come back right back to Canada too and be thrown on us, and it should be. So I'll leave it at that, but any thoughts you have?
Thank you so much. My first thought is, why haven't you met at U Ottawa? I mean, the things you'll learn on a panel, right?
Right. I've been meaning to track you down, and I was not going to be in Ottawa as much, but of course now I'm here with COVID. But so yeah. Anyway, thank you so much for this paper and this panel. I know most people on the panel, but no, it's a real pleasure.
It's funny that we haven't met. We meet on an online panel. But anyway, questions or comments are excellent, and I'm sure the panelists want to react. Feel free to whoever wants to speak.
I guess I can launch in here. No, thanks, Margaret. That was really good, interesting question. I mean, I think that you're getting at a really, I think you're getting at a really good point when you bring up this tension between the research and the advocacy side of things. I mean, that's certainly something that I have felt because I have talked to people in other research projects, specifically also gender advisors, who really feel like this is these kind of arguments are kind of a tool in their toolbox that they find is helpful to them when they're trying to do their job as gender advisors and doing gender work in peacekeeping, and don't necessarily appreciate people like me kind of coming around and debunking, if you want to use that word, these claims. At the same time, I mean, you know, researchers and advocates have different jobs. Researchers and people working in peacekeeping operations have different jobs. And while we should certainly be empathetic and respectful to their position and where they're coming from, it doesn't mean that we have to necessarily work in service of them. So, I mean, our job is to take these claims at face value and then look at them critically and see if they stand up. And I think, as you've pointed out, Margaret, I mean, people have been kind of pointing out that these don't stand up, and that's been for a while. So that tension is there, and that this is a tension that exists between researchers and advocates on any normative agenda. But it's just something that we have to also kind of accept and try to just be mutually respectful with each other.
Thank you. Are there more questions? I think we have time for one, maybe two, probably only one more question. Is there anyone in the audience who has a comment or a question? Please feel free to post to the chat or raise your hands.
While people are thinking, if it is okay, I can just jump in and say one more thing in response to Margaret's comment, which is just that I do agree that I think investing more into understanding exactly how we can improve kind of the military training or police training on this could be very helpful. I also think another concept that sometimes gets maybe underplayed is the variation within military and police institutions across branches, departments, leaders, etc. And so understanding kind of exactly how we can create more uniform training programs and norms within these institutions, which in some ways I think because they're so hierarchical can actually be a way to helpful for us if it's taken advantage of in an effective way. So just
Laura, when you talk about training, do we have in mind like training in the military forces of this or that country, or you have in mind the UN training?
I think both. I think a lot of times the UN training can be very helpful, but sometimes it can be compartmentalized to that, oh, that's only the UN, that's only on the mission that training matters. Whereas also integrating it into the military or police within the country can make it more consistent, and that this isn't just something the UN is telling us we need to do when we're deployed. This is something that can be done at home as well in other deployments, etc.
Thank you. Aileen, is there anything you'd like to add? We have about 2 minutes left, so you have about 2 minutes to add something.
No, it has been a very interesting discussion, and thank you again for inviting me and for this study.
Well, thank you for joining us. Kathleen, any famous last words? No, not famous last words. Any concluding thoughts?
No, I agree. I've enjoyed this a lot, and I mean, I think that that it'll be interesting or potentially depressing to see if in 10 years from now these discussions are still being had. I suspect that it will, because the world moves very fast, but also very slow. So, but it's been very interesting to read the report and have the discussion.
Well, thank you so much. I think that would be the end of the panel. I want to thank, well, first of all, also my research team, my colleagues who did that research. That was I think really an extraordinary group effort, but then also the panelists. Thank you so much for coming, sharing time. And a special thanks to Kathleen, because she was really, you know, she helped us a year ago with her time. So you set us on a good track. So that's very much appreciated. Thank you all. Have a great day and stay in touch.
I just left the link for everybody to find the report. It's in the chat. It's on the CIPS website publications.
Yes, please read the study. It's a good one.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you on behalf of CIPS. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.